Hi there, welcome back. This week we're going to continue looking at the skeleton framework, and we'll just pick up where we left off from last week. As you remember, we started creating our documents, which will serve as a reference document for us. We looked at all the various H tags, H1 through to H6, how skeletons reach those, the left float and right float, clearing the floats, different button treatments and link treatments that we can create in skeleton, both primary and sort of standard and full width, lists, code blocks, and tables. And we also made this table full width as well. And so we saw how that full width utility can be applied to many different elements. Today, so I've got my document open here, my HTML document, exactly where I left off. And today we are going to look at forms, HTML forms, and how skeleton treats those, as well as its grid system, which is really probably the most interesting and almost powerful part of skeleton. So let's get started with forms. So I'm going to add another comment, another section of my document titled Forms. And I'm going to just create a new div for this form. And oh, sorry, before I do that, I'm going to open. Let me just start that over, just so I don't confuse the matter. In that form section, first I am going to open my form using the form tag. The first part of that form, the div, is going to be like a text box where you enter a text box. So let's first, we would label that form, and we're going to call that name. I'm going to create an area that the user would input their information. So input type equals text, and you can put placeholder text in there, what the user sees before they put it in. We'll say enter name. And that's it for, I'm just going to delete these spaces. Our first area of the form. Let's save that, return and reload, and see how that looks. So there's our label, name in all caps, and enter name. I'm going to throw a break at the end of my table section just to give myself a little bit more space. Reload that quickly. And just to refresh our memory, I'm going to delete the link to this CSS and look at what is a standard HTML form. So we can see how differently skeleton styles out. So that's our first form section, first section of this form. And we're going to add a few more. Okay, so we're still within the form tag because it's still the same form. We're just going to create a new area. And this will be, we're going to give it a, open a new div, label again, and the label, I'll just put duration. And this is, we're going to create basically like a drop down. So still within the form element, first we have an opening div with that name input field. Close that div, we open a new div, and now its label is duration. This will be drop down, so we put a select tag in there. And here, within that, we're going to list the 3 things that the user can choose. So we type option for that. Value equals 1. And we close that opening option tag. And let's put a some text in there. So we have an opening. We have an opening option declaration. Before we close it, we put value equals 1. That's something that would be, if this was a functional form, that would be passed on to whatever is receiving the information from this form. And the user sees weekly. And then we close that option form. And we can just, we'll put 2 more in there. So I'm going to cheat and just copy that, paste and paste. Of course, we're going to have to change what those values are. So 1, 2, 3. And let's change monthly and yearly. So 3 options all nested within a select tag. This is all living within a div. Let's take a look at that. Save and reload. And let's see. So there's duration, that's the label. And clicking on that shows those 3 options that we put in. Let's do another. Again, we'll start with label, and let's put, this time we're going to put maybe a text field, a large text field box that the user would send a message to, like maybe an email query form or something. So we label it first, and then to call this up, it's going to be text area. We want the box, I want the box to be of a certain size when it's on the page. So it's not like it doesn't compress down when it's empty. So I'm going to just add a style to it directly and go minimum height 200 pixels. So this is just going to force that text box, even when it's empty, to have some significant size on the page. It's similar to the text. The small text box where the user entered their name above, we can have placeholder text on this as well. Placeholder text, and it'll be, I don't know, send us a message. And unlike the input tag up here was self-closing, sort of like an image tag, text area tags we do need to close. Even though it's empty, we do need to close it. So opening text area tag, added a style just to force it to be a certain height, and some placeholder text. Close that opening tag and then we close the tag itself immediately. Save again, reload, and you can see our little message. Cannot be shrunk down smaller than 200 pixels, but can be resized. Let's look at one more. Basically, here's the form. The users filled out the form, and then they want to submit it. Submit it to the system, which trigger probably an event, maybe JavaScript or PHP or something on the site. But we're just working with the design here, so let's create one last div. And once again, it'll have a label. And this label, we're going to do two more. This is, jumped ahead here. This is not going to be our submit button. We're going to look at check boxes. So this label, actually, we're going to put some code right into this. So within the label tag, I'm going to just put some returns in here because it's getting a little, oops, a little hard to see. So within the label tag, we're going to put another input field, but the type this time is checkbox. Up here, we had an input and the type was text. Here, we have an input, the type is a text box. Still within that label field, because it's going to keep everything on the same level. It'll make sense once we see it. I'm going to put a span class equals label dash body. And here we're going to put some subscribe to our email list, question mark. So this setup's a little different. The label itself, because it doesn't have a text area over the input itself. So we're putting the content all within that label tag. So we open a label tag, we create a checkbox, and then we're going to put some text beside that text box. Save that and make more sense when we see it, and reload, and there we go. So it doesn't have a label like these do because it's just simply a text box. We put all the text itself within the label. Now it's time for the last one, the submit button. And this one's quite simple. Again, it's another input. Class equals, and here we can say, we can apply what we looked at last week. We can apply some button function, button styling. So let's make this button primary. So we've styled it with the class using the button primary class. The type of input it is a submit button. And now we can declare what actually appears on that button. And for that, we put value equals, and we'll put submit and put on all caps. Again, the input class is self-closing, so we don't need a closing input tag. We just simply close off that opening declaration. Save that, come back and reload. And there's our submit button. There's our complete form. All this content is nested within the form declaration. So an opening form tag way down here, the closing form tag. The form itself is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 divs, and each div has a different element in it. So we have a standard text input field. We've got the drop-down field or drop-down selector. We've got a text area that we force to be a certain height. Got a checkbox with using the checkbox input type, and then finally a submit button, which will trigger an event. Like we looked at before with both tables and buttons, some of these elements, if we want them to be, we can make these larger. We can make these full width as well. And with that, I mean, what could we look at? We could look at the input type at the top. Right at the top, we're going to look at that name field, and we can add within that input tag, we'll put a space in there, class equals, as remember from last week, U for utility hyphen full hyphen width. Save, open that, and now you can see this is stretching the width of the page. Might be a little long for that, but maybe that's what you want. You can add that to more. The what else could we add that to? We could add it to. Could we add it to the text area? Let's see that. So again, in that text area, class equals utility dash full dash width. Save. And now that's full width. And then finally, if we wanted to, could make the button itself, that submit button at the very bottom, it already has the class button primary. We would go into that area, put a space, and then add the one that transforms. It's a full width as well. Still within the quotation marks. If we wanted that. Looks kind of nicer on the phone. I don't know if I do the name, the full width, but yeah, up to the designer. And that is forms. I'm going to add a break before we open up our last section. This is possibly one of the parts of Skeleton that you use the most of. It's it's their grid system. So Skeleton has a built-in and fully responsive grid system. Like columns and rows, and its own way, its own dictionary, its own syntax to create that grid system. So right off the bat, let's just put in another comment for our last section, grid system. First thing to note about the skeleton grid system is it is based on the 12-column grid. So you have the width of your web page is split up into 12 individual columns, or can be split up into 12 individual columns. It can be split up, you can do half and half, so a 6-column and a 6-column. You can do 4 3-column columns. You can do any combination of that, as long as you don't go over 12 in individual rows. So what we need to think of is when you're about to put some content across your page, and you want to split that content up into individual size boxes or columns, first thing we have to do is create a row. We have to tell the HTML to create a row, and then we're going to break that row up into pieces. So first thing that we do is we open a div with the class row. So now we were basically declaring this first row of content, the first row of our grid. And now we're going to split it up into, let's say we want a box that takes up 2/3 of that row, beside another box that takes up 1/3 of that row. So a big box and a little box side by side in this row. And this is where we're going to start. We have to remember, we have to know the skeleton terminology to create these. So we're within that row. We open a new div, and the class equals 2-thirds, because I want a 2/3 column. So 2/3 column. And now I'm going to put some text in there so I can see some p-text. I've downloaded a plugin for this is Visual Studio. I've downloaded a plugin, and I'll quickly show you how. If you go, let's see, what is it? Preferences, extensions. You can search. I searched for one. I want to be able to quickly put placeholder text in. And so if you search for Lorem, as in Lorem Ipsum, there's many different plugins you can find. You can try them, install them. They'll each operate a little differently. The one that I installed, I believe, was this one, Lorem whatever, I think is the one that I have. And what that allows me to do, and just close that, is when I'm in this p tag, I'm going to hold down Command and L, and it's going to put in, it doesn't wrap, that's the only thing that bothers me. It will put in a block of placeholder text. So it's helpful for this exercise. It's helpful for a lot of times when you're mocking up websites. So However you want, we just want to put some text into that, into this div. So I created a row, and then within that row, I created a div that is 2/3 column. I wanted to be 2/3 of the width of that row. And then I've just put some text in there. So let's see what happens. Save and reload. And you can see, you get a bit of a sense here. There's my text. It's roughly taking up, well, it would be taking up 2/3 of this row. This is the row here. If I want another little box beside it, and maybe that box, I mean, these divs can have images in them. I'm just putting text in, but they can, like any div, it can have whatever you want in it. I'm staying within this row because I want to I don't want to drop down yet to a new row. I want to put a smaller box beside that first box. So staying within that row, I could create a new div, and the class will equal, in this case, I want 1/3. So there's no S, like it's 2/3, because there's more than one, so it's 2/3. In this case, it's a 1/3 column with a space between 1/3 and column. And that's my next div. I'm going to put more text in there. Control L, just indent. And then that div gets closed. I'm going to get rid of these spaces to try to make it. So this is, we have to be a little careful here. We have to make sure we're doing this correctly. We always open a new row, a horizontal row. We open, within that row, I created a 2/3 column block, filled it with text, closed it, closed that div. I opened another div beside it with a 1/3 column, filled it with text, close that div, and now I close that row. Obviously 2/3 plus 1/3 is 3/3. That row is full. And you can see that is the 1/3 column beside the 2/3 column. I'm going to add something now just for illustrative purposes. It will help a little bit because we want to see, it'll make it a little bit easier to see these for the next part of the exercise, to see how these columns and rows are actually being written. Right now, they're just filled with text. They blend into the background of the page. There's no edge. So what I'm going to do, and this is really just for this exercise, I mean, you can do it if you wanted to, but is to add some background color and add a bit of a border specifically to these columns that we're building, so we can actually sort of get a better sense of where they are. So I'm going to be adding my own CSS now. And as I discussed in the previous week, within this website, we have our CSS folder and we've got 2 CSS documents in there. We don't want to alter either of these because these are essentially the skeleton CSS. You don't want to start editing them. You don't want to make changes to it. What we can do though is because we want to add our own, start to add our own styles to this page, and we do this to our own websites, is introduce our own CSS document. So let's go back into code, new file, And right off the bat, I'm going to save as, go into my CSS folder and call this styles.css and save. So as you can see here now, I've got my own CSS document within the CSS folder. It's currently empty. Now I need to load that into the page. So back onto my HTML page, going to the top. So where the CSS is being loaded, I'm going to, I know it's sitting beside this one, so I'm just going to change it there. This is key to remember. HTML loads from top to bottom. So it loads the normalized CSS, it loads the skeleton CSS, and now it loads my CSS. So anything that I add to my CSS, if it will override or add to the CSS that came before. So that's why I want to make sure I load my CSS last. Save that. And now I'm going to go back to that CSS document and start introducing my own style. So if I go back here and look at, what did I have here? This class being applied to these columns, there's actually two individual styles being applied to it. One's called 2/3 and one's called column. This one's 1/3 and column. So what I want to target over here is column. And now I'm just going to write some basic CSS. So I just want to see that the boundaries of these divs. So background, let's do F4, 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 border. Let's give it a 1 pixel border. That's sort of a darker gray. And we'll make sure that the border is solid. And then finally, I'm going to put a bit of padding in there of 10 pixels, just so the text isn't butted right up against the edge. Save that. Save that, which I think I already did. So now what's happening, the website loads normalizing the skeleton CSS, then it loads my style CSS, which is just adding a bit of color and a border and padding to the column custom class, which is applied to both my columns here. So everything's been saved, I think. Hold down Shift and reload. And now we can see, we can get a bit of a better sense of where these columns start and end. So that will help us a little bit as we continue on here. Let's see how else, what other commands we can use to sort of evoke this grid system. So this was all residing in one div with the row class applied. And that is very important to remember. If I'm ready to do another row, I need to create a new row. Within that row, we open our first block. And let's say class equals. So we we used the commands to create a 2/3 column, so a single column that is 2/3 the width of the row, and another column that was 1/3 the width of the row. Another way that we can work with these column commands is we can declare that this column should be made up of 6 individual columns. So remembering that each row has 12 invisible columns, and if we wanted a column that filled up half the page, we could say, so a new div that is class equals 6 columns. So we have 12 to play with. So making one that's 6 will be half of that row. Again, we're going to just fill it with some placeholder text. And then, what happened up here? I needed to close that. Something went a little haywire there, and then close that. Close that div. So we've opened up a new row. We've opened up a new block that will be 6 columns, 6 out of the 12 columns. So it should be half of that row. Pour some text into it, and then we close that div. Now I'm going to open another column. Let's say I want 2 boxes that are half the width of that row. So I open up a new div before I close that row, class equals, and in this case, I'm going to do it slightly differently. I'm going to go 1/2 column. That 1/2 column, you're saying a column that's 1/2 of that row. The row is made up of 12 columns. So a solid 1/2 column will be 6 individual columns. So it should be exactly the same as the previous ones. It's just 2 different ways of writing the same thing. It's really, there's no right or wrong. It's what you're more comfortable with. And again, let's put some placeholder text in there. And then, so I opened the row, I opened this 6 column block, closed that. I opened a 1/2 column block, which should be exactly the same. Close that. It looks like I don't have I need to close that row. I have to close this row up here. I'm going to save that and reload. And there we see those are two boxes that take up half of that row each. Something different here. This one doesn't have the styles. We're going to fix that. I also don't like the fact that this is butted up from the previous one. So let's address both of those. Right off the bat, let's put a space in there. So I have that first row starts here and ends here. So I'm just going to slip a break character in there. Gives me a little space. So why does this not look like this? This one has this style applied, the background and the border, from our custom CSS. Column, and then there's what's the CSS that's adding those colors. If we look here, this is the one that isn't showing up, isn't having applied. And that's because it doesn't actually have the column style applied to it. It has the columns with an S applied to it. So small difference, but obviously making a big difference here. But it's easy enough fix. I'm going to return to my CSS document. In the line above, I type columns. I put a comma before that. And then what this means is it's basically saying anything with the custom class columns or the custom class column, apply this. So save, reload, and there we go. So I'm just going to add a few more. Key thing to remember, always, always, always div class equals row. Always have to declare a row, a new row, before we start filling it. Let's see what else we could do. Really anything. Div class equals, let's do 8 columns. So 8 out of 12. So this should be the same as 2/3. Actually, let's just make it look unusual. Let's go 7 columns. Text again. It's and just see. So I've opened a new row. Within that row, I opened 7 columns. A box consisting of 7 of the 12 columns, and put some text in there and close that box there, and then close the row. You know what? Oh, before I do, I'm going to remember, before that row, I want to put in my break character so it looks nicer. Reload, and there's my 7 column box. Again, it doesn't, and I can leave that row. I can, if I come back here and declare a new row, I'm just going to copy, you know what I'll do? I'll do div class equals, let's say 3 columns. And again, we're putting the P lorem ipsum. And so that's my new row. I'm going to save that, and just to illustrate that, you don't have to fill the row. The cell I closed after my 7 column block, I close that row, so I go and it goes and starts a new one. Again, I want to put my little, keep forgetting to put the break in there, just so we can really see. So it doesn't have to be full. You can just do partial rows. The key is you have to you close that row before you add any more blocks. This one, I have 3 columns. Again, it's a 12 column grid. So if I have 3 times, I should be able to fit 4. 1, I'm just going to copy and paste. 2 and 3. So within this row that I created after that partial, after that 7 column row, I put in 1 3 column block, 2, 3, and 4. So adding up to a total of 12 columns, and then I close that row. So relatively simple. A lot of different ways you could have 12 individual skinny little columns if you wanted. You can have sort of any combination of those, as long as you don't go over 12. Just really have to watch your rows, always creating a new row, and always making sure that you're not exceeding 12 individual columns within each row. And that's where it often can get, things can go wrong. And I'll show you here. So if I'm going to go up here to this 7 columns. So this, the row that I had second from the bottom. Let me just go here just to show you. I'm going to alter this row right here. I'm going to copy that and paste it again, still within that same row. So I have that row, and now I do a 7 column grid, and then another 7 column grid. The problem here is I only have 12 columns in each row, and now I'm trying to put 14 in by putting 2 7x7 columns, column blocks beside each other. And this is where things are going to go wrong. You can see it just breaks the whole structure. It can't fit 2 of them beside each other. So it forces it down to the second. So while you're going through this exercise, if you're adding columns, if you're experimenting with them, and you start to see something like this happening, it's almost always that you have tried to put too many columns within a row, either by just forgetting, by missing that closing tag and opening another row or throwing more columns in there, or just by math alone. So I'm going to delete that, but it will happen fairly frequently. So, but that's usually where you want to look. You want to look at a row that just has too much in it. So just experiment with that. Again, this is only reload that so I can get rid of that mess. There we go. I've only filled with text here. These could be images. They really can be any kind of content. What's also really nice about this is it is responsive. So as the page shrinks down, you'll see eventually when we get to really small, like almost phone size, those columns stack automatically. This would be too small for them to run side by side. So the skeleton CSS, when it reaches a certain breaking point for a phone, it stacks them automatically, which is great. So it might take a little while just to get used to the terminologies here. You know, when is it columns and when is it column? When is it like that first one is a 2/3 column versus 1/3 column? But you know, you'll just keep trying it. You'll get the hang of it eventually. Just be very careful and check your work. Be very diligent with your opening and closing divs and your rows and your columns. And yeah, it's a very handy and powerful tool to create responsive web designs relatively easily. And then using your own custom CSS that we load, now you can go in and start fine tuning if you want to imply different fonts or treat, you know, your H1s differently. You would add it to this CSS document to sort of override the skeleton CSS without ever altering, never really touching the skeleton CSS itself. Once you've done this and now you've got this document that you can refer to, kind of refresh your memory if you can't remember, if you're working with skeleton later and you can't remember, how do I make that button a primary button? You know, this is basically a reference document for yourself. For submitting it, you're going to return back to this parent folder with your name _ skeleton that's been applied. That's going to be compressed. And that zip file is what would be submitted as part of the assignment. So good luck with that. And I hope you have a great week.